You come to law school wanting to help people or to solve legal problems, and you spend all this time in the classroom learning about procedures and standard of review and all this stuff, and you think, you know, where are the people, where are the problems?
It was night and day when I came here and all of a sudden had a person sitting in front of me. It was like a real person who had a real problem.
And we get a chance to try to help people, which is why I came to law school to begin with.
Having the experience of talking to people who really are a lot less fortunate than we are is something that a lot of lawyers never get. I don't think you can really do this work if you don't understand the society that our laws are functioning in.
For the students, I think it can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming when they think about how important their role is in representing this client. Sometimes the students say that they like the client so much and they want to help her or him so much that they feel a lot of pressure to do a good job. And I think that's great because that's the sense that they're going to have and take with them, hopefully, when they become lawyers and practice full-time.
We provide a very, very useful service to those who is most vulnerable in our society.
I felt initially hopeless, and they gave me some inroads, some information, and some advice that would help me to go forward and in this process.
First I was nervous, but walking out, I felt confident. I walked out with my head up high when, in a sense, I did walk in with my head facing down because of all the discrimination and everything I had gone through. I felt like this was probably the last thing I can do.
I mean, there is nothing that will clarify how all of the different bodies of law interact, how claims play out in the real world. There's nothing that will clarify any of that better than working with it.
Hi, welcome to the Workers' Rights Clinic. We're really glad you decided to join our program, which is designed to provide basic and practical legal information and referrals to low-income and unemployed people throughout all of California. So why don't we get started and see how the program works. The goal of this video is to teach you the basics of interviewing and counseling clients, so you're comfortable as you work with the many kinds of people who come to the clinic for legal help. Through the enactments in this video, we will show you some specific examples of how to work with clients. And you'll also see what other counselors, volunteer attorneys, and even some clients have to say about their actual experiences at the clinic. We'll cover 4 main topics in this video. First, we'll show you the basics of conducting an interview with a client and how to consult with an attorney to get advice to give to your client. Then, we'll provide tips on how to handle difficult clients. We'll cover cultural considerations and how to work with an interpreter. And finally, we will give you an overview of sensitive issues you may encounter. One note before we begin. Since the clinic operates in various locations that may have different procedures, what you see in this video might not apply exactly to your own clinical experience. For example, although we'll show you an in-person interview with a client, many of our clients are actually unable to attend a clinic location, so we have to handle their matters over the phone. Also, in some clinics, the supervising attorney will be present during your intake with the client. We're going to begin with a client interview. Let's start with some of the things you should avoid in an interview, what we refer to as the bad intake. In this enactment, let's see how Laurel conducts a client interview. See if you can spot all the ways that it becomes a bad intake. Then we'll do a rewind and I'll point out the mistakes she's making along the way.
Hi, Eduardo. I'm Laurel.
Hi, Laurel.
How's it going?
Well, I'm a little nervous because I've never been with a lawyer before.
Hey, despite what they say, lawyers aren't sharks. We don't bite. So why are you here today?
Well, I had a seizure at work, and I got fired.
Oh, were your other workers freaked out by your seizure?
No, not really. The only one freaked out was my boss, and he fired me on the spot.
Well, it's totally illegal for them to fire you for your disability. What did you do about it?
Well, they gave me a piece of paper to sign that I would get $500 if I signed it and waived all claims against my employer.
Well, if they're only giving you $500 to sign away your rights, I wouldn't sign that paper.
Well, if I don't sign this, will you help me with my claim?
Of course, they shouldn't have treated you the way that they did.
So how do we start my claim?
Well, in a disability discrimination case, whether you're under the ADA or the FEHA, you first have to exhaust your administrative procedures before you're issued a right to sue letter, which is the jurisdictional prerequisite in a civil action. Does that sound good?
Let's watch that again, and I'll point out the mistakes that Laurel is making.
Hi, Eduardo. I'm Laurel.
Hi, Laurel.
How's it going?
Well, I'm a little nervous because I've never been with a lawyer before.
Hey, despite what they say, lawyers aren't sharks. We don't bite.
Here, Laurel basically ignored the client's concern about the interview. Instead, she should have acknowledged his apprehension and put him at ease by describing the interview as an informal process. Notice also how Laurel failed to introduce herself properly, what her role was, and what the client should expect from the process.
So why are you here today?
Well, I had a seizure at work, and I got fired.
Oh, did the other coworkers get freaked out by that?
Laurel's body language communicates fear of the client. Instead, she should stay within a personal distance, maybe even lean closer to signal concern for the client.
No, not really. The only one who freaked out was my boss, and he fired me on the spot.
Well, it's totally illegal for them to fire you for your disability.
There are at least 3 things wrong with what Laurel just said. 1, she gave her legal opinion to the client without first discussing it with a supervising attorney. 2, she led the client to believe he had a surefire case by using words totally illegal. It's a rare occasion when lawyers use definitive language like that. So Laurel should instead have used words like, you may have a case, or to have a good case, you will have to prove that you were discriminated against. Finally, Laurel introduced a legal concept, disability discrimination, without giving the client any background as to what it means.
What did you do about it?
Well, they gave me a piece of paper to sign that I would get $500 if I signed it and waived all claims against my employer.
Well, if they're only giving you $500 to sign away your rights, I wouldn't sign that paper.
Laurel has committed 2 errors here. First, she didn't look at the document to see what it said. Second, she made one of the biggest mistakes lawyers can make. She told the client what to do instead of merely pointing out the client's legal rights and letting him make his own decision as to what to do.
Well, if I don't sign this, will you help me with my claim?
Of course, they shouldn't have treated you the way that they did.
Another big no-no. Laurel has led the client to believe that the clinic will represent him by taking his case. That's not what the clinic normally does. Instead, the role of the clinic counselor is to provide basic legal information and referrals, not to actually represent the client.
So how do we start my claim?
Well, in a disability discrimination case, whether you're under the ADA or the FEHA, you first have to exhaust your administrative procedures before you're issued a right to sue letter, which is the jurisdictional prerequisite in a civil action. Does that sound good?
Laurel is speaking so much legalese, you'd think she was talking to a Supreme Court justice. She should instead explain the procedures for filing a claim in plain English, using words that any layperson would understand. This is especially important for our clinic clients, many of whom may not have much in the way of a formal education. Since Laurel's interviewing skills are headed straight downhill, let's turn now from how not to do an interview to how you should do an interview. In the beginning of the interview, you first identify your role and purpose. Explain the clinic procedure and the scope of services the clinic provides. This is the part of the interview when you establish a relationship with the client.
The first night I was really nervous and I had a little outline of introduce myself, make small chat, and ask how they're doing. And so I really had an outline and I stuck to it actually the first couple times. The simplest stuff, but I had it written down because I was afraid I was going to somehow boggle things or ruin somebody's experience if I took the wrong steps. And then after several weeks, I didn't need to refer to that, and it just became easier. So some of it's just being willing to be uncomfortable initially and having faith that it gets easier.
Let's see how another counselor, Elizabeth, begins her interview.
Hi, Mr. Sanchez. How are you?
Good, I'm fine, thank you.
My name's Elizabeth, and I'm a counselor here at the clinic.
How do you do? Thank you for seeing me tonight.
Thank you for coming in. Have you ever been to the clinic before?
No, I haven't.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about the clinic. We're a free legal clinic that provides advice and referrals for low-income and unemployed people. We generally aren't able to provide direct legal representation, but what we do provide is a roadmap so that you can go forward and secure your legal rights on your own.
Okay, that sounds good.
Let me tell you a little bit about how the process works. I'm a trained legal counselor, but I'm not a lawyer. So we'll first talk together about what happened, and then later I will go and speak with one of our attorneys. The attorneys who work here at our clinic all are specialists in employment law. And then I'll come back and we'll talk together about what legal issues we've identified and what advice we have about going forward.
Sounds good. Okay.
And everything we talk about tonight is confidential. It's covered by something that we call the attorney-client privilege. That's a privilege that applies to us and to the attorney that we work with. But when people sometimes bring in family members or friends, we have to ask them to wait outside because that privilege doesn't apply to those people.
Oh, I understand that.
So before we get started, I need to ask you some questions about your income eligibility because, as you know, it's a clinic for low-income and unemployed workers. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Can you tell me about how much you make before taxes?
My yearly salary is about $21,000.
Okay, that qualifies. And I also need to ask you some demographic information. And the reason why we ask these questions, and the answers are all kept confidential, is because it helps us with our funding purposes, but also it helps us identify certain legal issues while we're going through your story and while we're talking about what happened.
All right.
So let me ask you a few questions. Can you tell me your age?
I'm 55 years old.
At this point, you will be asking the client a number of demographic questions, some of which may be sensitive, such as race, age, or sexual orientation. If the client does not want to provide answers to those questions, no problem. Just move on to the next one.
And what's your sexual orientation?
Why would you ask me that?
Well, in California, there's a law that protects people from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So we asked to help identify that in terms of an issue that might come up tonight. But you don't have to answer that question to continue with the interview.
I understand.
Okay, so you've finished getting the client's identification information and demographic background. You'll also be collecting basic information about the client's occupation and employer. Now you're ready to turn to the main part of the interview. This is the part of the intake where you get the client's story. It's important to use open-ended questions such as, "What happened next?" to allow the client freedom to respond. During this portion of the interview, the client will do most of the talking, ideally providing you with the story of what happened to him or her at work. After the client has presented his or her story, you should move to closed questions such as, "On what date were you fired?" which restrict the scope of the client's answer. Closed questions elicit specific information from the client and fill in any gaps. So let's see how Elizabeth begins the body of her intake with her client.
Why don't you tell me about what brought you in here tonight?
Well, about a week ago, I was in our room at work, which is our break room, and I had had a seizure at work, which is called a petit mal seizure, and I was recovering at that point and trying to get my composure back. And my supervisor walked in and saw me there and fired me on the spot.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Have you ever had a seizure before?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
Have you had them all your life?
I have had them all my life, and but it's usually something that I just jump back from.
Mm-hmm. And about how often do you have a seizure?
Now at this point, about once every 3 months.
Yeah, generally what happens when you have a seizure?
Well, usually I black out for about 2 or 3 seconds, and then I kind of snap back out of it, and I'm usually a little groggy, and I need a little to compose myself, but I can usually within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, go back to work and complete my job.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes me about that long.
Mm-hmm. So you were doing this 15 minutes of recovery time in the break room when your supervisor came in?
Yes, I was. He just thought I was goofy enough.
Mm-hmm. And did you tell him what happened?
I explained to him what happened, that I had had a seizure, and that that I had always gone back and completed my job, but he just did not accept that and fired me on the spot.
Throughout the interview, remember that the story is being told by the client from his or her own perspective. With many workplace problems, however, there may be two sides to the story, and it will be helpful to your client if you find out what reasons the client's employer would give as an explanation for its actions. For example, Elizabeth could simply ask her client, "What do you think your supervisor would say if he was asked why he fired you?" So at the conclusion of the intake, you should identify what the client's goal is in terms of resolving his or her situation.
And what are you looking for? What's your ideal resolution to this situation?
What I would like to see happen is for me to get my job back. I enjoy my job. I have bills to pay, and I would like to come back to work.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything else that you'd like to tell me about your situation?
No, I think that just about covers everything.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and speak with the attorney about what you've told me, and we're going to identify what we think the legal issues are and give you some advice about what to do going forward.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
After you complete the intake and ascertain the client's goals and questions, the next step is to consult with your manual to review the laws that apply to your client's situation.
There's a common mistake that I see is that a student has not looked in the manual before coming to speak to the attorney. The manual is an excellent resource. The manual is all-knowing, all-wise. It is much wiser than I am, for sure. In that the students almost always correctly identify, hey, here's the issue, here's what's important, I know there's an issue about this. And I ask, well, what's the rule about that? You know, can they ask about a prior conviction? Well, what's the rule?
Well, it's a challenge because you could be speaking to your client for a good half hour and you have all these facts in your head, and what you have to do is distill it down to about a minute or two of the really relevant facts.
The other thing is, it seems like they might have some fishiness about their time cards.
So that can be challenging because, as I said in the beginning, you're not even sure what the law is, and so you're not sure what's important to tell the attorney and what's not. And that process does get easier as time goes on.
Now you're ready to discuss your client's case with the supervising attorney. When you talk with the attorney, provide a summary of the case facts in chronological order and separate the legal issues to be discussed with the attorney. Also, suggest a proposed resolution for each of the legal issues in the case. The attorney will consider this information and will work with you to come up with legal advice that you will then present back to the client.
Hi, Anita. How are you?
Great, Elizabeth. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. I had a really interesting client today. His name is Mr. Sanchez, and he works at a company called Widget Company, and it's a factory. They have about 55 employees. And last week he had a petit mal seizure at work, and he went into the break room to recover. He was in there for about 10 or 15 minutes. And while he was in there, his supervisor came in and thought he was goofing off and just fired him on the spot.
Well, first let me tell you that was a great fact presentation. I really appreciate getting the facts chronologically because it really helps me sort out what happened in this case. So good job on that. So based on what you told me, what do you think the legal issues are here?
Well, I looked in the manual, and it seems like we might be talking about disability discrimination.
Okay.
The way he described his condition to me, it sounds like a form of epilepsy, and that would be a disability under California's Fair Employment and Housing Act, at least as far as I could tell.
Actually, California law is broader and does cover Mr. Sanchez, broader than, for example, the Americans with Disability Act or the ADA. So let's go with FEHA coverage in this case.
So under the FEHA, I thought that he would be entitled to a reasonable accommodation, and it seemed like the breaks that he needed would be that type of accommodation that would be appropriate and legally required under the FEHA. They're pretty short, and he also could get back to work right afterwards.
Okay, that's all correct. How do you think Mr. Sanchez should handle his disability discrimination case?
Well, he told me that he really wanted to get back to work right away, so I thought maybe he should write a letter to his employer. Tell them that he has a disability and that he needs an accommodation, but instead that he was fired, and maybe ask for his job back.
I actually really, really like that advice because it's important for us to help our clients resolve their case before, say, filing a lawsuit.
And I also thought I should probably give him the number for the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. I looked it up in the manual. That way he'll have it in case the letter doesn't work.
Absolutely. Are there any other legal issues you can think of?
I think that's it.
Well, did you ask Mr. Sanchez whether he filed for unemployment insurance?
Oh, I didn't think to ask him that.
That's all right. Well, let me help you out with that. So in your manual, it talks about the elements for unemployment insurance. The first element for unemployment insurance is whether he was terminated for misconduct. The second is whether he will be able and available to work while collecting unemployment insurance. So based on that, do you think Mr. Sanchez is eligible to collect unemployment insurance?
Well, misconduct is something like stealing from the company, right?
Right.
Okay, well, with that in mind, I don't think he engaged in any misconduct. He didn't have any control of these seizures. He was trying to get back to work. So yeah, I don't think there was misconduct here.
Okay, absolutely. That does not sound like a definition of misconduct, so we're good with that. So the second element to collect unemployment insurance is whether Mr. Sanchez was able and available to work. So based on that, do you think that he was able and available to work? Or do you think he is right now to collect unemployment insurance?
Yeah, I think he's able and available to work because all he needs is this reasonable accommodation, and then he could be back on the job.
Right. So based on the first element and the second element, he's able to collect unemployment insurance, most likely. Okay. So where does Mr. Sanchez go to file for unemployment insurance? Do you know?
Well, there's so many California agencies, I just can't remember the name.
That's okay. It's called the Employment Development Department, or the EDD. The contact information is in your manual, and if you just open it up, give him the contact information, he should be good to go.
That's great.
Okay, so why don't we go over what you're going to tell Mr. Sanchez?
Okay, well, first I'm going to tell him that he has a disability, at least under state law, and that he's entitled to a reasonable accommodation.
At this point, you would repeat back to the supervising attorney what you will tell the client. This is a nice way to ensure that you understood what you and the attorney spoke about. It's also good practice for your follow-up meeting with the client. Elizabeth and Anita now discuss details of how to apply for unemployment insurance. Let's go back to see them wrap up their discussion.
He should contact the EDD, and I'm going to give him that phone number, and I'm also going to give him the phone number for the DFEH.
Excellent job, Elizabeth. I really enjoyed working with you, and Mr. Sanchez is going to get some really good advice.
Thank you so much, Anita.
Take care.
You too.
One other nice thing about doing clinic experience in as a law student is that you have your supervising attorney who's right there next to you. We like to think of the experience as sort of like driver's education, where they have a steering wheel, but we've got one as well. So things can't go too wrong before we'll jump in.
When you meet again with your client, explain one issue at a time. Allow the client to ask questions and take notes while you were providing the information. At this time, you should also provide the client with any written materials or phone numbers the supervising attorney has suggested to you. Let's spend some time looking at how Elizabeth informs her client of his rights and what his options are.
I had a chance to speak with the attorney about what we discussed, and so I have some information about what we think your legal rights and options are. We identified that there are two legal issues that came up with what happened to you. The first is disability discrimination, and the second is unemployment insurance. And what I first
At this point in the process, you may be spending some time going into detail on the options available to your client. Here, Elizabeth continues with her full explanation of the issues involved in this case.
And the Fair Employment and Housing Act also says that people with disabilities, if they need them, are entitled to what are called reasonable accommodations.
You should then end the session by explaining that you are concluding the counseling relationship so that there are no continuing expectations from the client. But also be clear that if the client has any new questions or issues, he or she is free to contact the clinic again. Point out, however, that he or she will likely talk to a different counselor.
Just be sure to tell them that you've been here before, and we can pull your file, and that'll move things along more quickly for you.
Okay, that sounds good.
Do you have any questions?
No, I think I'm pretty much going on this for right now, and I feel confident. Thank you.
Good. Well, best of luck to you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
The hardest ones for me are always the ones where I have to tell somebody they don't have a case. And surprisingly enough, they come up more frequently than you would think. I'd say a third of the cases, maybe at least, are cases where you have to tell someone, I'm sorry, I know it's really been bad. Like I was saying earlier, like I know something bad happened to you and you weren't treated well, but there's no legal action for that. And that's difficult. What you'll find though too is I've had a few people say to me that even though they didn't have a case, it was very important to them that they had been heard and that they felt that someone had listened to them.
Now let's talk about working with clients who may be more challenging to interview. I'll call them difficult clients. We find that most difficult clients fall into 3 general categories. The first category is clients who are reluctant to discuss particular topics. They won't want to answer your questions either because the situation is very personal or because they are afraid to trust you. For clients like this, you should begin with open questions to allow them some control over the conversation. If they don't respond to open questions, change the pattern and ask closed questions, the kind of questions that call for a specific answer, such as a date or a name. And you should emphasize confidentiality and reiterate that the purpose of the conversation is to gather information to help the client. In this next enactment, observe how Cormac interviews and builds trust with a reluctant client who has experienced sexual harassment.
He would always say things about me.
The sort of things that would make you uncomfortable, is that sort of the way it was? Okay. Let me just remind you at this point that a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about is probably going to be hard to remember. It's going to make you feel uncomfortable. And just remind you that everything we talk about here is completely confidential. And our purpose of going through all this stuff is to make sure that we prevent your employer from doing this again. The behavior that he engaged in is not acceptable, and we want to prevent that sort of thing happening in the future. So what we'll do is we'll just take this, step by step, very slowly, and try to, start with the first thing that you can remember that he said to you that made you feel uncomfortable.
One time he came up to me and he said that he was thinking, he couldn't stop thinking about my body all day.
Okay.
That kind of stuff.
In order to get clients to understand how the law works, you try to get them to understand that there's a certain language you have to speak. And even if they have, hundreds of facts that they want to include in their case, you have to kind of get them to step back and say, well, here's what the law says, and here are your facts that fit best into the law. So a lot of times people come in there, they just want to tell their story, and it's understandable. You have to give them their space to do that. But you have to sort of pull it back and help them narrow down the facts that are really just going to help them, as opposed to those things that just sort of mean a lot to them.
I call myself being ahead of the game. I put the information down on paper, but he knew the right questions to ask me to get the proper information, get it structured, because I was just all over the place. I'm just thinking I'm mad, and he was able to just kind of structure it for me so that I know what I was saying.
Here's an example of a rambling client and how one counselor, Shelley, handles the situation.
He says something that is condescending. It seems to me that he felt that it was amusing to have a Chinese accent working for the restaurant. So when he was saying this, I just kind of started worrying about him, because I used to work for a retail a store, and the manager was exactly the same type of guy, and he would be flip out for something that is not that important. And when I was folding clothes on the shelf, and he felt that I was not doing the way that he liked, and he would just be upset and yell at me. And come to think of it, a lot of people like this. My brother, I remember 10 years ago when we went back to China with my parents and my family, and he was...
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if we can, I'd like to have us focus on what happened to you at work. And the reason for that is because your boss's comments about your accent might form the basis for a legal claim. So I'd like to have us focus on the issue that you had with your manager. So let's get to the core of your problem at work. It sounds like you had the sense from the interview that the manager was treating you differently because of your accent. Was there a specific time that he referred to your accent again?
I remember 3 incidents that he makes such comments.
Notice that Shelley is using one of the simplest techniques to work with the talkative client. She's converting the interview to closed questions, which help to limit the client's responses to only the information that's relevant to the case. And observe how Shelley gave the client a reason why she had to focus on the language issue. By doing that, she signaled to the client that she sympathized with his predicament, but nevertheless had to focus on the legally relevant issues. Now, what's the best way to wrap up an interview with a talkative client? This can be a delicate situation. One method is to let the client know that you've spent an adequate amount of time on the case, but you still have a final question to ask. That will send a signal that although time is up, you're still interested in the client's case and are paying attention.
Okay, so even though we've spent a good deal of time talking about your case today, I have one more question for you. Could you summarize for me why you think it is your boss fired you?
I think eventually he decided it was not amusing for a Chinese accent guy working for an Italian restaurant.
Notice that Shelley asked the client to summarize the situation, to focus her talkative client. If that doesn't work, then use more specific directives, such as, tell me in one sentence or two why you think your supervisor did this. The third category of clients who may need special handling are those who arrive at the interview upset or angry, or who become upset or angry during the interview. Be aware of your own feelings and remember that the client's disposition could be due to many things, including a mental health condition, and is not necessarily something you did or said.
Oftentimes, the hostility manifests itself at you, the attorney, or you, the student, but in reality, the hostility is towards the employer, and the hostility is towards the injustice that they feel in their situation. And so usually having a receptive ear, trying to understand where they're coming from, and helping them redirect their energy and maybe some of that anger, not at you, but at the perhaps, in a positive direction.
Clients who come to the clinic have had something bad happen to them, and often they've even lost their jobs. They may have contacted several agencies and attorneys before even coming to you. And it's up to you to change the pattern and to be empathetic to the client's situation. Practice active listening by validating what the client is saying. For example, repeating back what the client is feeling may be helpful. If they continue to be upset, angry, or hostile, remember that you're not alone and you can get immediate help from a supervising attorney or another staff person. In this next scenario, our student counselor, Pam, is working with a client who becomes angry during the interview. Let's see how Pam deals with it.
So I talked to the attorney about your drug testing question. So let me tell you what she said. Basically, because your employer gave you notice about random drug testing and because you work in a safety-sensitive environment, your employer may have a legal right to drug test.
Did the attorney tell you to say that? Because I really need to talk to an attorney now. I think we're wasting our time right here.
Because of the way the clinic operates, it just isn't possible for the attorney to meet with everybody individually. But I can assure you that I understand your case very well and that the attorney and I talked about everything that you and I are going to talk about today. Sometimes these tests return false positives.
All right. I did not do any drugs. I mean, this is ridiculous. I'm totally going to sue these people.
I think that we can solve your problem without your having to go through the time and the cost of suing your employer. One thing that you can do is you can go to your employer and ask for another drug test because you think that the first one was a false positive.
With a hostile client, it's important to make clear that you hear the client, as Pam does here, even if you don't totally relate to their predicament. Notice how Pam diffused the situation by continuing to suggest positive approaches to the client's problem.
You can also volunteer to undergo regular drug testing for a limited period of time to prove that you're clean.
I guess it's better than nothing.
In this case, she channeled the client's hostility into doing something positive, which was to request an additional drug screening.
是这样，我觉得这是一个非常好的这个法律的一个咨询的机构啊。 给了我们这个新的移民啊，在劳工法上很多的这个帮助，让我们明白了很多这个美国关于劳工法律权益的事情。
Because many people who come to the clinic may not be fluent in English, the clinic often uses interpreters to assist in conducting interviews. The most important thing to remember when working with an interpreter is that you, not the interpreter, are conducting the interview. So during the interview, you should speak directly to the client, not to the interpreter. The interpreter then translates what you've said to the client, allows the client to respond, then translates the response back to you. Interpreters should always speak in the first person, using phrases such as, I said, or my boss told me, when relating what the client has said. And you should avoid having a conversation with the interpreter that excludes the client. So now you're going to see an interview with a Spanish-speaking client conducted by a counselor, Samir, with the help of an interpreter.
Since I don't speak Spanish, and we are fortunate enough to have Ricardo here translating for us, I want to make sure that I understand everything that you tell me.
Entonces, porque yo no hablo español, afortunadamente tenemos a Ricardo aquí para traducir nuestra conversación para que yo pueda entender todo lo que usted dice hoy.
Me parece bien. So I'm going to speak in short segments so that Ricardo can translate everything I say, and I'm going to ask you to do the same so that Ricardo can translate everything you say to me.
Entonces yo voy a hablar en frases cortas para que Ricardo pueda traducir todo lo que yo diga. Y le pido lo mismo a usted que hable en frases cortas para que Ricardo pueda traducir todo lo que usted dice.
Muy bien.
All right.
So let's talk about what brought you into the clinic tonight.
Entonces, ¿no puede decir por qué vino a la clínica hoy?
Pues sabe que yo trabajaba para un restaurante y yo creo que me deben dinero y por eso estoy aquí.
I used to work at a restaurant and I believe they owe me money and that's why I'm here.
Okay. And what was the name of that restaurant?
¿Y cómo se llamaba el restaurante?
El restaurante se llama Blue Moon, queda por la calle Misión.
The restaurant's name is the Blue Moon and it's located on Mission Street.
And I noticed from your intake form that you weren't paid overtime. Can you tell me exactly what happened?
Noté en su formulario que no me pagaron sobre tiempo, entonces ¿me puede decir qué ocurrió ahí?
Pues sabe que yo trabajaba ahí unos 3 años y trabajaba día y noche sin quebrada y yo sé que trabajé muchas horas y nunca me han pagado.
Notice that the client has been speaking for some time, which will be almost impossible for the interpreter to translate correctly. The interpreter will normally ask the client to break up his sentences into a more easily translatable form. And if the interpreter doesn't do this, then you should ask the client to speak in shorter segments, as it's done here.
Okay, I was a cook and I wasn't paid overtime that I believe I was owed.
Okay. I don't think I was able to get everything that you told me. If you could possibly speak in shorter segments so that Ricardo could translate everything, that would be very helpful.
Creo que no pude tomar todos los apuntes que usted me dijo, entonces podría hablar en frases cortas para que Ricardo pueda traducir.
Sí, como.
Sure, why not? Thank you.
In interviews where you need an interpreter, recognize that it will take longer than an interview conducted solely in English. That's normal. Let's turn now to an overview of sensitive issues that you may encounter when working with a diverse range of clients. It's important not only to watch for sensitive issues, but also to notice how you react to those issues. One common issue is domestic violence. Domestic violence cuts across lines of race, nationality, language, culture, economics, sexual orientation, physical ability, and religion. And since clinic clients may be victims or survivors of domestic violence and other crimes, you must be in tune to this issue. Many times, the domestic violence victim comes to the clinic asking for help with a problem, such as time off from work that may initially seem unrelated to the domestic violence. It's your job to be a good listener to see if there might be a domestic violence issue behind your client's workplace complaint. This is especially important because domestic violence victims may be legally entitled to additional benefits and rights. Some of our clients may suffer from chronic or long-term illnesses such as HIV or AIDS. Regardless of how healthy they may appear during your interview, these clients are living with a serious disease and should be treated like any other client who has a disability in the workplace. Many of our clients are recent immigrants. Some of those clients may be fearful if they do not have legal immigration status in the United States. Although undocumented workers are entitled to most of the employment protections afforded to U.S. citizens and legal residents, they may not trust agencies, including this clinic, for fear of being reported to immigration authorities. Here again, you should tell those clients that what they reveal to you is confidential and won't be used against them. It's important not to assume that a client is heterosexual or to presume the gender of the client or the client's partner. You may work with clients who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Always respect and mirror back the client's choice of pronouns, names, and titles. Some of our clients may have criminal records that may affect their ability to obtain and maintain employment. However, there are legal options available for those clients. Again, do not make judgments or assumptions about these clients because of their backgrounds. Let's now address issues of culture and language. Given the incredible diversity of California's population, you're certain to interact with clients from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Taking a client's background into consideration is helpful when you communicate with the client. And also be aware of how your cultural values and background influence your interactions at the clinic.
In the South Bay, there were people from a lot of different backgrounds who, in those backgrounds, were not like mine. So I sort of had to acknowledge that we were coming from a different place, but didn't accept that as a barrier to us being able to relate to each other. So I encourage students now to set aside as best they can all the preconceived notions they have about a particular culture or race or group of people and deal with the client as the human being that's sitting in front of them. And when you keep that in mind, all the other things, all the race and the culture, all that sort of falls away, and you get to deal with someone one-on-one and get to know them, separate from these ideas that you had before you entered the interview.
After watching this video, I hope you're excited to join our clinical program. On behalf of the clinic, and especially our clients, we're really looking forward to working with you.
Watching students as they first interview and how long it takes, and then by the end of the semester, they're able to do 3 and 4 interviews and get the same, they deal with all of the issues and can spot them more concisely. And
that's a really wonderful part of teaching, is to see that blossoming occur.